Good evening. I'm Melanie Risden with the Western Standard. Thanks for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're going to be speaking with a doctor in Ponoka. He is an Alberta doctor, a family doctor. His name is Dr. Gregory Chan, and we're going to be talking to Dr. Chan about the uphill battle doctors are facing when it comes to not only diagnosing vaccine injuries, but also the uphill battle in reporting them, and the system just ends up being frustrating, and yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge. So why don't we chat with Dr. Gregory Chan? Thanks for joining me this evening.
Hi.
So you have had a situation where you have had patients come through who have been what would seem vaccine injured. Why don't you tell me a little bit about sort of how the process has gone when it comes to somebody coming in and talking to you about the potential of experiencing a vaccine injury or an adverse event from a vaccine?
Well, since the vaccines have been approved for use and people in the general public have been using them, it's been rolled out for different populations as time has passed. I think it's important that we are vigilant to see if there's any symptoms that are unusual or different related to this new treatment. Usually what happens is that when we're seeing patients, we would, when I see a patient, we'd take a thorough history, then you do a physical examination, and then you come up with a diagnosis. But seeing how a lot of people are taking these vaccines, I thought it would be important to ask the question when someone presents with new symptoms, whether it's in the clinic or in the emergency department, to ask the question, have you had any new treatments in the last 3 to 4 weeks before these new symptoms developed? And, if you're doing your standard history and physical before COVID, you wouldn't normally ask that question. But now that we have this new treatment that's out there, I think it is important to ask the question. And I don't think patients really have that in the forefront of their mind, because if you just do your standard pre-COVID history and physical examination, it doesn't come up unless you actually ask about it.
Right. So you're running into where situations where your patients aren't even sort of connecting the dots or thinking that it potentially could be related.
Yes, and I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. When the vaccines were first put out there, that the messaging around it is that once you get the vaccines, you're good. You don't have to be concerned about anything. You can return to your normal day-to-day activities. So I think a lot of people were under that understanding that they could take the vaccines and then that they didn't have anything that would be connected to it or be concerned about it. But when you see people, like, for example, in the emergency departments or in the clinic, and they have some new symptoms, and you ask the question, then there are people that have had new symptoms or worsening symptoms of a particular condition that are chronologically associated with taking the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that you have personally seen quite a few people who have suffered what you have been able to, in your assessment, link to a reaction to the vaccine.
That's correct. So when I ask the question, if there isn't a chronological association, you just carry on with your regular assessment. But if there is an association, then you have to start asking a series of questions to carefully determine if the symptom is chronologically related with the vaccine or not.
Mm-hmm. And so how many people would you say you have seen that would have presented with something that appeared to be a vaccine reaction or adverse event?
So by definition, an adverse event is something that is a new symptom, so something that's brand new, or it could be a pre-existing condition, but the symptoms are increased intensity or different in character to what it was before receiving the treatment. So those criteria have to be met for it to be a vaccine-related event. So by my calculations and recording this since June of 2021, I have 50 submissions to the adverse event following immunization program in Alberta.
Right, and that's run by Alberta Health Services. I actually looked into that and inquired about that process. Apparently, the group that assesses these reports is a group of AHS nurses. They will either follow up with the patient and get any additional details they need, or they will also sometimes follow up with a physician if they need further details. But one of the challenges you were mentioning is that once you've sent that off, you may not hear anything again. And so these are patients that you're treating, that you're dealing with, patients that potentially have concerns about what they're seeing, and you likely have concerns about what you're seeing, and you don't hear back, or you don't get a summary of the situation in many cases.
That's correct. So of the 50 submissions that I've had about 21 that I've received feedback on, and of those, I've had clear direction on whether the submission is accepted or rejected for about 12 of those cases. So that's what I've experienced with making these submissions. And I should note that this is with the Alberta program. The Alberta program is supposed to be linked with the Canada, the national program of vaccine injury reporting.
Okay.
So there is a difference between the two, and you're supposed to be able to submit to one, and then it gets uploaded to the national program. But there is a screening process that occurs once you make a submission. So the AEFI team will look at the information, and they will also phone the patient. And then even after my assessment, where I determine that it does fit chronologically, the symptoms are either new or worse than previous. There is other criteria that have to be met for it to be accepted as an adverse event. And that other criteria is something that I am not privy to.
Oh, okay, yeah. Now, can you explain to me? I mean, you've seen a lot of people. What kinds of things are you seeing when it comes to adverse reactions and events?
Well, thankfully, a lot of the adverse events are minor. So the minor ones would include like a very unusual rash, fever that persisted for more than a couple of days, fatigue. A lot of those symptoms have resolved for my patients, thankfully. Some of them are more significant, and those ones those ones have mostly resolved for the patients that I've submitted the adverse events for.
Now, some of the more severe ones, what have you seen there?
Well, without going into a lot of detail, because for patient confidentiality, I can't say too much. But I've had one patient that ended up having a change in sensation for one half of the body after having their first injection. And it took several months for that to go away. We had sent this person to see specialists and had other investigations done. And there was no clear answer as to why this happened. I had another young person who already had COVID. They had fully recovered, and they were a high performance athlete. So during the time of having COVID, they were sick and they couldn't perform at their usual intensity level. They were almost back to their intensity level, and then had their first vaccine, and then had a serious event. They had to go to the hospital, and then at least 2 months of a lot of exertional fatigue, chest pain, shortness of breath. And this is a high performance athlete, so they know what they are typically able to do, but they could not perform at the level expected for several months. Thankfully, this person's back to their usual level of functioning, but from what they described to me, it sounded like quite a serious event.
Mhm. Now, I think looking at some of the more severe events and knowing that some of those were rejected as an adverse event, therefore, likely the patient would not be able to receive any kind of exemption, and it sounds like there's sort of an understanding of what criteria would determine what an exemption would be provided for. And it sounds like that is solely for somebody who has an anaphylactic reaction. Is that what your understanding is too?
That's correct. According to the physicians that are part of the public health in our college, they state that the only medical indication that qualifies for an exemption is anaphylaxis to the first dose of the vaccine.
So, in some of these circumstances where you've seen people somewhat severely or severely injured, as a doctor, you're treating this patient. You, of course, want what's best for your patients. Is it concerning to you that a report would come back and still be encouraging them to have dose number 2? I mean, I would imagine that would be a bit concerning.
Yeah, it is quite concerning. This young person that had a severe reaction and could not participate in sports for at least 2 months with with shortness of breath and chest pain. They were told to get their second dose, and that's it doesn't fit with the college guidelines.
Mhm.
Doesn't fit with what the medical officer health is advising patients to do. But at the same time, this person had a very, very serious reaction. So it's understandable that the patient is concerned about receiving a second dose. If I imagine if I was in their situation and I was faced with the same scenario of having a severe reaction like that, I would also be hesitant.
Mhm. And it's got to be difficult being a doctor because you are sort of in charge of, well, I guess you would have to be careful at what you're advising them moving forward, right?
That's right. I mean, I can't deny the reality of what's happened to some of my patients. Again, thankfully, a lot of these, most of the people that I've submitted adverse events to, they were mild reactions and they've resolved. But for the ones that have persistent symptoms or have more serious side effects, um, I as a physician, I'm supposed to be advocating for my patients. If my patient has had an event that was um, quite significant and they're still having symptoms, then it is my duty to stand with my patients, to say something for them, and to advocate for them. And I think I'm doing my job by doing this.
Yeah, agreed. I did speak with two other Northern Alberta doctors who both asked to remain anonymous, and I can understand why. There's a lot of pressure that doctors are facing when it comes to talking about this, and I think one of them even finished the conversation with me saying it's really unfortunate that I can't have this conversation with you openly, for fear of having some sort of a reprisal from the regulatory bodies, whether it's the College of Physicians and Surgeons or some of the other colleges. It's sort of doctors are being silenced, and this isn't something that they're feeling comfortable or able to even speak to. And one of the doctors that I was speaking to said exactly sort of this idea that it's never really been this way where the college has interfered so much with the client, or sorry, the patient doctor relationship. I mean, you're there, you're hands on with this patient, you're seeing them, you've cared for them for however long, and then to have a third party, or even the team of adverse reaction report, the people that are sort of reviewing these reports come in and make these determinations from the sidelines, they said. It's very concerning to them.
Yeah, it's my job as a physician is that I'm supposed to be taking a proper history, physical examination, and making an appropriate diagnosis. And in situations like this, where a patient has had a negative outcome from taking a medical treatment, then I'm supposed to believe them. I'm supposed to listen to their story and what's happened to them. And I'm not supposed to dismiss them. I'm supposed to listen to what they have to say, and um, I'm supposed to walk them through it. And that's my job, is to walk with my patients.
Mm-hmm.
And if they've had a negative reaction, then I'm supposed to stand with them. And it's unfortunate that there are other regulatory bodies that would encourage them to take that treatment again, knowing that they had a significant reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're actually going to be speaking with some people who have had unbelievable reactions and adverse events that are incredible. So we will be speaking with them in just a bit here. One of the things that one of the anonymous doctors had also mentioned is that a lot of these patients are just they're up against a wall. I mean, some of the doctors that are treating them don't know how to deal with what they're seeing. I mean, they're seeing tests aren't revealing things, but yet they're still suffering from symptoms. And so what this other doctor said is that, they're really concerned and sad about how some of these people are being treated and they're just not getting answers. They're sent home. And then, very few physicians will even bother to look into it any further. So they're just kind of left on their own, struggling to be well.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part. I mean, it's not satisfying to be in that situation where you don't have answers. And certainly, being a doctor, you'd like to help people and you'd like to try and fix whatever's wrong. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, in these situations, if we can't find an answer and they still have symptoms, then and there isn't much that I can do medically as far as treating it. There are some other things that we could try, like waiting to see if there are other jurisdictions that have other recommendations. Unfortunately, there isn't much that's out there, but it just requires regular follow-up to say that, just check in to see how they're doing, and I think that's the important thing, is to still maintain that relationship. That I do believe what's happened to them, and that we'll try and investigate the symptoms as best we can.
Right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your perspective on this uphill battle when it comes to even just reporting the adverse events here in Alberta, and some of the people that I'm going to be speaking with are from other parts of Canada that are running into similar situations, which is very unfortunate. But thank you, Dr. Chan, for speaking with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. I do have to say that it does put you in a really strange position, because number one, I'm supposed to be advocating for my patients, and when they've had a reaction and they're told that it is an adverse event, and they're told to have the treatment again, that's a very unusual situation to be in. And I feel compelled to stand in the gap and to stand up for my patients. Even when they're told that it doesn't count as an adverse reaction, we're kind of left in a situation with the patient still having symptoms. And then what do you do? And I'm left in the same situation. I have to stand with my patients.
Absolutely, and I'm sure your patients appreciate your dedication to them, for sure. I know there's a lot of doctors who have even told me that there's real pressure and there's a bit of a fear in doing what you're doing, just for the recourse that they could face.
And it really comes down to informed consent. So not only have they done that process of taking the vaccine for the first time, but after having experienced what they've experienced, they're still exercising their informed consent. They've had something happen, they've thought about it, and they're informing themselves as far as whether to make that medical decision again. And I think that's a medical principle, an ethical principle that we have to uphold.
Agreed. Well, and hopefully with more awareness of this, we will see change. So we've also got Sean Muldoon joining us, and Sean is from Langley, BC. He is a quality manager for an industrial supplies company, and Sean had quite an experience after he was vaccinated. Why don't you tell us a little bit about when you got vaccinated and what happened?
I got vaccinated in April of last year, and end of April, and initially everything was good. I wasn't too concerned about it at the time. Next day I had some flu-like symptoms, kind of typical, a couple hours sore shoulder, and then that was it. And so I didn't really worry about it too much. But about a week and a half later, I went to bed and woke up in the middle of the night, and I was having some pretty severe abdominal pain. Just kind of wrote it off like something I ate, maybe something didn't agree with me. But I spoke to the doctor the next day. I started vomiting, which is very uncommon. And so he said, we'll give it a few days, maybe call 811 just to double check, talk to him about COVID symptoms. And I didn't have any, so I didn't worry too much about it. I did have a fever a few days later. And so I did go get a COVID test, which came back negative. I didn't really eat all week, bit of like chicken noodle soup, nothing was really staying down. And then on Friday, I called the doctor back. Initially, it was Monday when I spoke to him. So I spoke five days later. And I just said, I'm not getting better. I said, I'm still in quite a bit of pain here. My stomach's in a knot. I've barely eaten all week. And he said, okay, well, we'll give it another day or two. And if you're still having issues, we'll investigate further. And then that night, I just deteriorated rapidly. The pain got very intense. I started vomiting quite violently. The next day, I've had a pretty rough night. Well, it's been a pretty rough week altogether. I went to the bathroom and I was in a lot of pain. I started vomiting and I started passing blood as well. So I called my wife at that point and I just said, I've got to get to the hospital. I said, something's wrong. When I got to the hospital, I actually went straight into the emergency room bathroom and I was just throwing up profusely. And I was lying on the floor in the emergency room bathroom. I couldn't really get up because it'd been a pretty rough week at this point. And my wife was checking me in. So I finally kind of got up and walked out there and I got checked in. And they didn't initially know what was going on. They didn't know if I was passing the kidney stone. I couldn't get off the floor. They kept asking me to get off the floor, but the pain was just kind of so intense at this point. I don't even really remember a lot after getting checked in. I can't tell you what the doctors looked like or the nurse or anything. Regardless, they did a bunch of tests. They did some blood work. My D-dimer was off. My platelets were off. They still didn't know what was going on. And this was about noon. And then the next thing I really recall was getting kind of like rushed into surgery. It felt like we were running. And I asked the nurse if I was going for surgery and she said yes. And I said, so this isn't a stomach bug? And she kind of laughed and said no. And I asked the surgeon what time it was because I kind of lost track of everything going on around me. And he said it's 3:30 a.m. or 3 o'clock in the morning. So at that point, I kind of realized, oh, something's very wrong. And then when I came to, they told me that I had blood clots and that they'd removed about half my small intestine. It was about just over 6 feet of my small intestine needed to be removed because it was dead. It had the blood cut off to it. And so the next couple days later, they left a bunch of really bad intestine in me, hoping it would recover because they'd taken as much as they could, they said, and for me to still hope to have some semblance of normal life afterwards. They went back in and the intestine was recovering. There was about 10 centimeters they had to take because it was gone. So that was my second surgery. And then they stitched me back up. They did some more scans. I've had a bunch of CT scans and they found some more clots. They found clots in my lungs, in my spleen, my abdomen. The one in my portal vein or my liver is the one that had cut off the blood supply to my intestines. And then a couple of days after that, my blood had been sent off to McMaster University Ontario, where they do a lot of the vaccine research and whatnot. And the
Okay.
results had come back and they'd confirmed that this was vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia. And basically a team of doctors set up a table beside my bed in the ICU and had a little meeting, and one came forward and said, you know, we've done the investigation and this was caused by your vaccine.
Yeah, and so based on the timing, it sounds like that was kind of, well, so you started struggling at about a week and a half after the vaccine, and then, but you know, it was about 2 weeks by the time you ended up being hospitalized.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned about some of the tests, like you said, your D dimer was off. Now, I understand that that test is something that registers blood clots. So,
Yeah, so D dimer, everybody I've spoke to that got diagnosed with VIT, when they ended up in hospital, they were getting just like off the charts D dimer. I knew nothing about this, obviously, at the time. My D dimer was in the 30,000s, 33,000 or 34,000. It should be almost undetectable. Within a few days of getting on the IVIG treatments and the prednisone, it was down under 1,000. It was at 800. The problem with D dimer tests, it tells you something's wrong, but it's kind of non-specific. So
right.
when they get a D dimer result like that and they see it's at 33,000 instead of non-recordable, basically, it just implies something's wrong. And the next day when I came out of my initial surgery, the first one, you know, my surgeon was, everybody involved in like my care was phenomenal. I can't like detract from the medical staff and the surgeon and the team of doctors. He was checking on me multiple times a day, and he wasn't even working that day. But sorry, he was kind of the one that came forward and said that they couldn't find any of the typical markers for blood clotting. He said that he suspected that this might be vaccine related because I didn't have any sort of the traditional markers they look for with blood clotting.
Right. And so just again to confirm, you had the first dose of Pfizer. Is that correct?
No, it was AstraZeneca.
Oh, the AstraZeneca. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that one has been you know, well documented to be responsible for a lot of blood clots.
Yeah, it's one of the things I was quite kind of content to hear over the next kind of 5-6 weeks. Multiple provinces said they were going to stop giving it out. A lot of countries already had due to the blood clot risk. In BC, the reason they gave for not giving out more was due to limited supply, which was a little frustrating. I was in the hospital at the time. And I just received a video. It got texted out to everybody from our provincial health officer that said, just so you know, if you got AstraZeneca, you made the right choice. All of our vaccines are very safe here in Canada. Meanwhile, I've been in the ICU for 3 weeks while they try to figure out basically how to keep me alive at this point. But then in, I guess it was October and November, Canada approved Johnson & Johnson, which is basically the same thing. And so at that point, I was quite upset to know that more people were going to be put at risk for VIT, like I've been diagnosed with, and potentially have to go through something like this. You know, up until a month or so ago, I had no colon. I'd lost half my small intestine, but they weren't able to reconnect what was still there. So I've been living with very little intestine for the last kind of 8 or 9 months, basically. And I just didn't want to find out that Canada was going to proceed with giving this vaccination out to people and potentially put them in this kind of like a health risk. And unfortunately, Johnson & Johnson is a very, very similar vaccine, and it's also documented to cause it as well.
So you ended up getting the first dose, and they were very clear that this was a vaccine-induced injury. Do you have an exemption now? Do you have an exemption that doesn't expire? Like, what position are you in now?
I do have an exemption at the moment. Initially, I was told I didn't qualify for one. There was kind of a blanket statement. I don't know if they used it across Canada or North America, but it basically said if you have a history of thrombosis or thrombocytopenia from a previous vaccination, then go get an mRNA, basically saying, you know, yeah, we know that vaccine almost killed you, but this other one should be fine. I've been told by a doctor in the hospital until you're recovered from this, once this is ancient history, then we'll discuss another vaccine. Until that point, you're not getting another jab. I spoke to a hematologist. I was supported in that. That was how we were proceeding. And then when the vaccine passport came into place a few months later, I called and asked for an exemption. And my hematologist got back to me and said, I'm sorry, but you don't qualify because of this. There was a page of exemptions and who was eligible for a deferral. And unfortunately, if you'd had thrombosis and thrombocytopenia that was vaccine induced, it was go get an mRNA, go get a Pfizer or Moderna. But after being told by a doctor, after being, discussing with a hematologist, there's no way I was getting another vaccine at that point. I was terrified at the thought of getting another vaccine after what the first one had done to me.
Well, of course, and especially considering, the situation where you've been told that you've had, such a large amount of your intestine removed. Like, I can't imagine if it you had a similar reaction, and what's the option, right? Like, that's just so right now you don't have an exemption.
No,
like
what ended up happening is another woman in BC who was diagnosed with it as well. She'd been in contact with numerous sources trying to get an exemption. And then at the end of December, or back in December, we were both on CBC. They did a little article about us trying to get an exemption after having these vaccine injuries. And they actually cut to a little clip of our provincial health officer, Bonnie Henry, saying, oh, we're aware of these cases, but it's a long process and whatnot. And the next day, this woman in Squamish got a letter from our deputy provincial health officer, Brian Emerson, and it included a temporary exemption just until her hematologist could confirm that it was safe for her to get another vaccine. Because when I was told that I needed to get another one, that was the first question I had for a hematologist is there any sort of documentation, studies, research that says it's safe for me to get this jab? And she just said, no, there's not. And so being in that position, I was, like I said, mortified at the very thought of getting another one. About a week later, I was told to send everything to our deputy provincial health officer as well. This was letters from a hematologist explaining why they were reluctant for me to get one. I still have it. I'm still producing these antibodies almost a year later that caused the blood clots. So they didn't want to proceed with the operation, with the surgery to reconnect my colon, because I'm still producing these antibodies. Yet the province was telling me, go get another jab. So I provide all that information to the deputy provincial health officer. And then about a week later, I also got a letter with a temporary deferral from a second jab. But it's literally like a piece of paper I pack around with me. And it's pretty beat up and ragged now because it's been almost, 4 or 5 months of keeping this thing in my back pocket. And then every time I go to a restaurant or to an event, I pull out the piece of paper, I explain the scenario to them. They go get their manager goes and talks to the owner, and then finally they come back. And as of so far, I haven't had any issues, just beyond them having to kind of go and confirm that it's legitimate, because it doesn't really look legitimate, to be honest. It's just like a piece of paper you could have typed up at home. But it's literally like, I, Bonnie Henry, do give permission to Sean Muldoon to go to the pub and to hockey games. Signed, Bonnie Henry, basically. So that's what I tell people. I go, I've got a letter from Bonnie. She says I'm allowed to go to the pub. And so, yes, that's where I've been for since December. I got that. In the months leading up to that, I was getting furious. I was livid. I lost a lot of sleep, ended up medicated just because I felt like I was being punished for going and getting the vaccine. It just felt like I didn't even question it. I just went and got the vaccine. I didn't really worry too much about it. And then, I was in the hospital for over 2 months. I was on massive doses of medication. It affected my vision, was blurry. My mind was shaky. My hands shook constantly for months. And so for them to turn around and say, go get another jab, it just seemed ludicrous. There was no way I was going to. And then when I finally got that deferral, it was right before Christmas. They just kind of announced, if you're not double vaxxed, the expectation is you don't go to Christmas dinner. And so I was really, really upset at the time. I was ready to go, chain myself to the doors of the Parliament building and cause a stink because I was so upset about it. And then I got the deferral and was kind of able to sort of get back on with a somewhat normal life.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, in BC, the vaccine mandates are set to lift. Is it April 5th? 5th, is that
April
right?
8th, I believe. It's
April 8th, thank
yeah.
you. So that's going to make things a little bit easier, but of course, we still have federal mandates across Canada, which would still impact travel and whatnot. I would suspect at this point that your exemption would work there, but what are you going to do? Like, what are your thoughts when somebody says the exemption is no longer valid? I have to, like, what's your decision?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I think I'll just be back at square one again. I'm gonna have to again reach out to the powers that be. If you have to reach out to politicians, I spoke to my local MLA. Everybody's on my side. I haven't really dealt with anybody who thinks that I should just kind of go out and get another job just to get on with my life. I still think if you're only getting a vaccine because you want to go to pubs and concerts and travel, you're kind of getting it for the wrong reason to some degree. They keep calling unvaccinated people selfish, but going to get a vaccine so you can go to the pub is just as selfish. Right? It's kind of like it's getting vaccinated for the wrong reasons. I don't want to put these vaccines in my kids right now. This has been too traumatizing on my whole family, on my wife, my friends. If they take the vax passes out, I'm prepared to live with those restrictions for the time being, because that's my choice moving forward. I'll probably be very vocal about it though, because of the circumstances around this all.
Absolutely. And I was just talking to a doctor here in Alberta who has dealt with many vaccine injured and has reported many as well. And, it puts some of these doctors in a very tough position as well, because he says, I'm trying to advocate for my patients. I care about their well-being, and I'm trying to advocate for them. But yet, the only, I don't know if it's different in BC, but in Alberta, as far as the College of Physicians and Surgeons go, the only adequate reason for an exemption here is if you've had an anaphylactic reaction, and you actually have to get the first dose to see if you are going to have that kind of reaction. And so it seems to me that a person who had to have multiple feet of their intestines removed because they died from blood clots, and this was how your body reacted. It's concerning that somebody would say, but you're still required to do number 2.
Yeah, and I mean, it wasn't me who approached them and said, I don't want to get a second vaccine. I'm scared now. I was approached by a doctor specifically to talk to me about a second vaccine. This doctor approached me to tell me that we're not giving you any more vaccinations at this point. We need you healthy before we even consider it. To have a doctor tell you that, to talk to your hematologist, to have them on board, and then to have the province, and this isn't because they looked at my case specifically and made like a decision based on my health, that I should proceed with getting another vaccination and it was safe for me to do so. This was just a blanket statement. And so that's when I realized that the doctors are handcuffed. My hematologist said, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. They said it was ridiculous. There was an expectation for me to go get another job at that point. But there was nothing they could do. Their hands were tied. And then that's when I started to really appreciate the position that the doctors are in, where they're dealing hands-on with a patient. I dealt with these doctors, my hematologist I've been dealing with now for coming up on a year. I don't know how many times I've spoken with them. Same with the doctor in internal medicine. When I was just readmitted to the hospital back in January, was dealing with that same doctor again. These are doctors that they're comfortable with my file, they're working with my file, they're working with me directly, and they don't think I should get another jab. But then the province comes along and says, well, we have this policy, and so he's got to go get one or he's not allowed to go to a Canucks game. And that was really, really, it was a tough pill to swallow, knowing that my doctor's opinions were being disregarded for some general blanket statement that was put on a document that I don't even think the province created that document. I think it was either federal or provincial or even North American wide.
Well, and we've also got Corrine Moore joining us as well. She's an Ontario mom, and she works in the tech industry part time, and is also again a busy mom. And Corrine had an adverse event, an adverse reaction to the vaccine as well, a bit different than you, Sean. But Corrine, why don't you give us some details about when you first were vaccinated and what happened for you?
Sure. I had my vaccine last August, and I was fine until the next day when I woke up. Breathing felt different. I had discomfort in my chest, but I assumed it was the immune response that I had heard so much about in the media. And but then the pain intensified, and 2 weeks after my first dose of Moderna, I felt like I was having a heart attack, with intense stabbing pain in my chest and radiating pain up my shoulders and upper arms. And I went to Emerge twice that week. And over the course of that week and the next months, they ran tests, blood, ECG, KG, echo, CT scan, x-rays, stress test, Holter monitor. I was in and out, at least twice a week, more often than that at times. And just to try to figure out what was happening. And the tests were not definitive. I was told that I probably waited too long to detect some of what had been happening before I came in. And I waited so long because I thought it was normal at first, that this was maybe just my immune response. And anyways, I couldn't lie down. The most challenging part for me, other than the pain and difficulty breathing, because every breath hurt, was that I couldn't lie down to sleep at night because the stabbing pain in my chest was so intense that I couldn't breathe. So I had to sit up in bed and lean forward to alleviate the pain. I was having palpitations, shortness of breath, and the cardiologist treated me for pericarditis, but I reacted to the medicine with a severe full body rash. And I felt like I couldn't breathe at all after my first 3 doses of the medicine they gave me. So I did stop taking the medication. I was unable to get a hold of my doctors for a week after that to figure out what to do. And in the middle of all this, my family doctor asked if cognitive behavioral therapy would be helpful for me, which added insult to injury, because I had no history of needing cognitive behavioral therapy to handle anything. And these were purely physiological symptoms. And the lack of sleep was definitely affecting me, but I needed my pain treated and my symptoms treated, and I needed to be able to breathe.
So they were sort of likening it to you having anxiety.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah. And I've never had anxiety. And it was anyways, with the exception of 2 of my doctors, it became very clear and apparent to me that the specialists wanted to wash their hands of me. They didn't want to tie it to the vaccine. I spent, just hours in pain by myself with no medical care. I felt like abandoned collateral damage and unacknowledged abandoned. And then 2 doctors finally stated that it was clearly a reaction, but that their license was on the line. They couldn't definitively, there was nothing that they could do. And one doctor even went as far as to say not to vaccinate our children, but that they wouldn't write an exemption because they can't. I was unable to do the simplest tasks like cooking or cleaning. I remember taking my kids shoe shopping and leaning against the wall. I used to ride my bike 80 kilometers a week, or, I'm a very active person. I remember leaning against the wall, taking my kids to get shoes and just not being able to breathe, standing there, helping them with their back to school, shopping. I would go for a walk around the block with my husband, and I remember just trying to keep active and ending up leaning on him and saying, I can't go around the block, take me home. And that's unheard of for me. So eventually I did get the pericarditis diagnosis. Uh, while a doctor wrote an exemption for me with no end date, after the public health review, it came back with an arbitrary end date 6 months from submission. So even now with an exemption, I still cannot get on a plane or a train to visit my parents across the country, nor they me, because they don't. Our family actually has a history of vaccine injury, so I was reluctant to get it. My sister spent 5 years in a wheelchair after the first year of hepatitis B vaccines were given in grade 7. And my mom was diagnosed with severe intolerance to all medication by a Toronto General Hospital doctor. So, and for instance, when I have antibiotics, I pass out. I don't react well to pharmaceuticals. So I've always had to treat myself through food and healthy lifestyle. And I've just, that's how I've managed my whole life. And so I was very reluctant to get this vaccine, but my life was too inhibited to be able to live without getting it. So I had a choice to make, and I clearly made the wrong one, because to this day, I'm not who I was. I have daily pain. I have chest aches. I have air hunger. I have to strain to breathe, and my breathing muscles ache and hurt because it takes work to breathe.
So you've been given this temporary, but at some point, you are going to be expected to get another vaccine by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that this is, that you have remorse, that you have that you look at this as, would you say that you would never do it again? Would you say that this was a mistake?
Yes, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I knew that I have sensitivities to medicine, and in normal times, I would have opted out because of my personal health needs and my body. I know my body. I would never tell somebody what to do for their own body. And so it was very invasive for people to be telling me what to do for mine. It was, certainly. I've felt close to death many times since that vaccine. And I've, from being a completely healthy person with a full life, and my life is very different now. And will I do it again? No, because for me, I believe that there's a very significant chance that I could die with another shot. Interestingly, listening to the other story, they suggested that I not get another mRNA shot. Instead, I go to AstraZeneca.
Yeah, and I do hear that. I have heard that from many people, that that seems to be what a lot of the healthcare practitioners are saying, is if you had a bad reaction to the vaccine that is not mRNA based, then try the other one. But ultimately, I couldn't imagine how terrified how terrified you must feel, having suffered that, still suffering that, and have to consider being able to participate in a normal life, in in the public, travel, things like that. You would have to risk it again.
Yeah, it's it doesn't feel like the Canada I used to know.
Do you have it? So your family doctor, is your family doctor advocating for you, or again, is this a situation where there's too much on the line for them?
I don't feel supported by my family doctor.
And so your symptoms are lingering. They are still, you are still struggling with this. This is not rectified itself for you.
No, I have had I've had to seek alternate help, because the doctors kept saying, we don't know what to do. We've given you the medicine. That's all we have. And I
Right.
reacted to it. So I've sought alternate therapy. I've had great help from an osteopath actually with my breathing and muscle straining. And I also had intercostal chondritis, which is pain between my rib cage muscles, which was also triggered by the vaccine. And that's been greatly reduced from my osteopath treatments. And I've also sought help from several naturopaths who have helped with treating my inflammation and have been very supportive in researching global best practices for somebody with my sensitivities to be able to heal as best possible.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Sean? Have you been able to access much for additional treatment, or have you sought out any other options elsewhere?
I haven't sought out many options, but like my experience being quite a bit different again. I was getting blood work every 2 weeks for all of last year because they wanted to proceed with this next surgery. So I've basically been in constant contact with my hematologist the entire way through this. It wasn't until I ended up back in hospital in January that they realized my health was deteriorating. Just my lack of intestine, being malnourished and dehydrated had kind of caught up to me. And so when I went in the last time, they decided to set up a little bit more outpatient care, which was like outpatient dietitian. Internal medicine was kind of going to keep up on my blood work every month. And then it was decided to just proceed with this surgery. My health was deteriorating. My doctor said, you're slowly dying, Sean, so we got to get you reconnected. So I still have some, I just had a surgery 6 weeks ago. And so I'm still recovering from that. And then there's still some aspects of things that were happening last year when I was first kind of sent home from the hospital. Your head's not on properly. Your focus isn't right. My body's weak. You can't lie in a hospital bed for 2 months and come out feeling particularly good. And so I've got a bit of a recovery ahead of me still from a year of malnourishment. Well, not a year, I guess 9 months, plus this last surgery that I had. So I have had a lot of outpatient care. I will just add though that, I was in the hospital being told almost the same thing. I was being told we don't know how to treat this. We don't know anything about the side effects, and we know even less about treating them. They were looking at cases out of the UK, across North America, trying to figure out what to do with my care. And this is what I'm being told by doctors in the hospital. I probably met with 20 different doctors over the 2 months that I was in the hospital. And that message was repeated to me numerous times that they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to treat me. And that is very frustrating when you've gone and you've gotten this jab and you know that they're giving it to millions of Canadians, but the doctors don't even know how to treat the side effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that's one of the things that I heard from the doctor that we were speaking to as well, is that these doctors are dealing with something so new. They don't know what they're up against. They don't know. I mean, sometimes you're getting test after test. It's not showing what it should be, but yet you've got people who are still suffering, with symptoms, and these doctors are sort of at a loss for how to treat them and how to best care for them. So it's definitely an issue sort of on both sides, and too many questions, left unanswered for doctors and patients. And it's got to be just a frustrating situation to be in.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I didn't have any hesitancy going to go get my vaccination. I didn't really understand how come some people were nervous to or scared to. My family's never had an issue with vaccinations. So I just went in and got my jab. I didn't even question it. After 2 months of being in the hospital and talking to doctors, a lot of doctors and a lot of nurses and healthcare professionals, hearing about the adverse reactions that they'd seen When you're in the hospital with a very serious vaccine injury, people get very candid. I had nurses tell me they were not vaccinating their children, that they didn't want it. This was before the mandates were in, that they were going to lose their job if they went and got it. So a lot of nurses at the time weren't vaccinated. And I left the hospital, 8 or 9 weeks later, with a much, much different attitude towards vaccines, towards vaccine safety, and just towards people's choice to put it in their body and their opinion of why they were going to do that. Because I didn't leave the hospital 2 months later reassured that I was just some crazy fluke and I was just very unfortunate this happened. I left the hospital 2 months later. I'm pretty rattled when it came to vaccines, and really just saying, if you don't have any fear of vaccines, it's like the tourist that walks up to take a picture of a bear. It's almost irresponsible. You should have some fear of them, because there is the potential for you to be very seriously hurt or even killed. I was told by one doctor he's amazed that I lived through this. So
wow.
Yeah.
Similar experience for our next guest, MLA Shane Getson, Alberta MLA, and somebody who came forward in February and shared an adverse event that he had. Similar story from you, Mr. Getson, that the fact that when you were in the hospital dealing with this adverse event, you had mentioned that you were speaking with some of the healthcare staff about it, and they had, casually said, you were our third in this evening. We had a little bit of trouble technically with trying to get our story or hear your story. So let's start again. And why don't you explain to us when you got vaccinated and what happened?
Sure. So I guess just to predicate that, again, we did. Our family had COVID back in January of 2020. So it went right through our family. My wife, she has a medical background. Her parents both are medical backgrounds. Her dad was a chief of staff, ran a hospital for 30 years. So again, when we had it, we went through all the events. It was different depending on which member of the household had it. I didn't have that bad of effect from COVID Classic. My wife and oldest son and oldest daughter had more adverse outcomes from COVID itself, but we all weathered the storm. So when I went and had my vaccination, I was held off right until last fall, until September 22nd. And again, like the last guest, in a position of an MLA, I get to hear lots of stories coming in one way or the other of people having success and others not so successful. And what really makes a person pause is when you see how many medical professionals chose not to have this particular vaccine. And it's not with vaccine hesitance or anti-vaxxers or any of the other words that were invented during this last period in the last couple of years. It really comes down to people making the choices for the right reasons for themselves. Myself, I've had lots of vaccinations before, zero problems, absolutely zero problems at all. So I think I shared with you earlier before the technical difficulties, I'm a private pilot as well. And in my age bracket, we have a full medical every 2 years just to make sure that we're fit to fly. I waited until the fall, until I had my annual was due to do that. That way I had a baseline of exactly where my health was at prior to a vaccination as well. And again, zero medical history prior to this. I'm one of the most boring people that when docs or nurses ask to do the forms, because there's nothing on there, no issues, no health issues, no health problems, fit as a fiddle. So when I went in and had my vaccination, it was on the same day that my medical was performed for my flight exam, zero issues. Or September 22nd, I go and have my first jab in my left arm. So I'm inoculated with the Pfizer, the first dose. Immediately following that, sicker than a dog in bed for 2 days at home. And we were going into session on the Monday. And part of the reason why I did it as well was to be a voice for others. Again, to make sure my voice was still heard and theirs in the house. And I didn't tell anybody my vaccination status because quite frankly, I don't think it's anybody's business. And the same as the vaccine passports, et cetera. I was just abhorrently against that. So paid for my own tests and everything else to be in the house. So then my symptoms progressed. It was just one autoimmune type issue after another, severe arthritic type pain, aches and knees, joints, my shoulder. I started losing mobility in my shoulder, difficulty to sleep at night, started getting chest pains. This all took the place over from September until December 22nd. And when I started having some chest pains, that's when my wife said, okay, enough of this, go in and see the doctor and see what's going on. So when I saw my family physician again, he ran a battery of tests. Again, I could barely lift my arm, shooting pains. It snapped, it cracked, a bunch of things there. Through the chest x-rays, run full blood work again, and electrocardiogram again, some ultrasound on my arm to find what was going on, chest x-rays. He discovered that I had a partially collapsed left lung as well, and couldn't explain what was going on. The good thing with the news on the blood work was there was no strokes, there wasn't any heart issues. So then over the Christmas break, it was trying to get mobility back in my arm. By a few weeks after that, in the second week, I should say, in January, developed a massive rash across my thighs, and raised, difficult, troublesome, bothersome, whatever you want to throw at it for which words, very uncomfortable, but doable. You could kind of work through it. And I was still working with the lung, trying to do deep breathing exercises to reinflate my left lung, or partially collapsed left lung. And a week following the rash, all of a sudden my face started puffing up. And over the course of about 4 to 5 days, as you can see from that photo you just flashed up, I looked like somebody who went 10 rounds with Tyson with no prize money.
Yeah.
Ended up in the emergency room and in the hospital emergency in Sturgeon County Hospital. And in passing, speaking to one of the security people there, he had said I was the third person in 20 minutes with some type of weird allergic reaction coming through. It was just busy that night. By 5 a.m., I went in at 9 o'clock, and no respiratory issues at that point. So there was no closing of the throat or anything else. With my wife's medical background, she told me to take some antihistamines to see if that would bring it out. Zero effect. The emergency room doc shot me full of Benadryl in there, so injectable Benadryl wasn't bringing it down. She didn't know what to do with this, sent me home that night, or that morning, I should say. I guess it's about 6 a.m. I was discharged, and made a recommendation, or a referral, I should say, to go see a dermatologist. That would take place over the course of about a month later, 3 weeks to a month later. Let my doc know on would have been Monday, and I received a prescription for prednisone, so a steroid, essentially a heavy dose for 3 days to reset my immune system. And then that stopped the reactions that were taking place. But it was over the course of about a month, roughly, of ice packs all the time to try to bring the swelling down. And then when I was in the truck convoy, that was a week after, and I had my son with me with an EpiPen to make sure that, I didn't have any reactions in case I did, anything along those lines. And again, a little bit of difficulty breathing. And then where I'm at right now in the recovery, well, actually, I guess I should jump ahead. Once I got to see the dermatologist, he also disclosed that there was lots of challenges out there. Even one of his own staff had issues and with it. But when he was looking at my information, it's almost like the docs can't jump to the conclusion themselves. They're almost leading you into it to ask what you think is going on. And once I, regaled the story, told him about the pictures, he had seen those, said the incidents, said I believed it was an autoimmune reaction caused by the injection of Pfizer, the first one I'm having an adverse reaction. He agreed. And he looked at the pictures, and what was definitive for him was the rash on my legs. And he says that there is no question that's what's going on there. So the docs too are having issues. My own family physician or medical doc, he couldn't say anything with it. He couldn't do anything. He had to have a specialist. And then the specialists even are at the point where, this one doc had said they've made it so difficult with reporting on this particular vaccine. He says it's almost like you roll up and see a car crash taking place, but you're not in the driver's seat at the time of one of the cars. So then it wasn't an accident, because now you can't report it because you're not in that particular circumstance. And his frustration was, with any vaccine, you want to report it. There are going to be side effects, that's just a given. But this one, it seems so darn difficult that it's making it challenging for everybody. So right now where I'm at in recovery, my lung is reinflated. My movement is coming back in my right shoulder. I can pick up 15 pounds now. I'm pretty excited about that. if you've ever seen me before, I'm about 6'2", 230 and a farm kid. So being this
Yeah,
week,
so
I'm very
15 pounds
humble.
is nothing.
No.
Yeah, that's tough.
And right now it's just tired all the time. And if I work more than 8 to 10 hours, I really start developing those symptoms again of aches and pains. So it's pretty humbling, quite honestly. And right now it's just through the process of working through formally applying for the vaccine injury and having that recognized by the federal government.
Now doing that, what about getting an exemption? So do you have an exemption? Do you have a temporary exemption? Where are things at for you with that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a catch-22, and right now I officially do not have an exemption. So I'm in the process of getting an exemption through their process. Now, you would imagine, and I mean, you flashed that picture up when I shared that with fellow colleagues. Again, I didn't tell anybody what was happening with me. I didn't want to prejudice anyone's decisions for what they were doing. I wanted to make sure that obviously I documented information and I spoke for both sides, whoever chose to get vaccinated or not. Again, I'm not a medical professional at all, so people have to go reconcile with that and do that. But even when I shared my picture and told my story to my own colleagues, they're going, well, you're exempt. And I'm going, we're not. And on that program, I technically am not exempt. Well, they couldn't believe it. So therein lies the frustration when you look at the system and what a person has to go through versus what would be common sense.
Well, and Shane, one of the struggles too is the doctor that I was interviewing a little bit earlier, an Alberta doctor. It's, I actually spoke with a couple of doctors who wanted to stay anonymous because of the threat. And one of the doctors actually said to me at the end of speaking with me that it's a travesty that I can't publicly speak about this with you. I can't tell you what I've seen and what I've experienced on the record because my license is at stake.
Yeah.
To me, I'm having that doesn't seem like it makes sense, for the transparency, but also the fact that we're still dealing with something that's fairly new as far as vaccines go. We're still dealing with something that was emergency use authorized and still is. It is still in a trial phase up until 2023. And so this doctor that I've been speaking with said it's one of those situations where we should be documenting everything. We should actually be looking at everything as suspect and then working to rule it out, not the other way around. So it's and I understand. There's a part of me that understands that it was the goal was to get people vaccinated to protect the public, to protect the population. And the hope was that was going to sort of be the cure-all, the end-all to this pandemic. But, to go so far as to silence people and not give them a voice for the vaccine injuries or the adverse events that they've suffered, and to go so far as to interfere with doctor-patient relationship, to go so far as to make it difficult for doctors to have conversation, even amongst themselves, to share information is, I think I agree with him. It is a travesty.
Well, there is. And again, we want to take that catchphrase, trust the science. Well, scientists will sit around and want empirical evidence, and they want to bring that forward and talk about it. And again, in the position of an MLA, I tabled 63 testimonies in the House of medical professionals that were having issues that would not take the vaccination themselves or being pushed into it. And folks have to understand too, there's layers to this onion. There's the federal mandates that are taking place that are out of our control. There's the jurisdiction for health within the provinces that we have jurisdiction to lay out there. And again, the province, we took away the ability from ourselves to have mandatory vaccinations. So Bill 66 did away with that. But then it's left up with AHS and the College of Physicians, coupled with the Ministry of Health, of where the docs actually fall into play here as well. So the College of Physicians, there's appointed positions on there from the government, but there's also the doctors from their own community come out and fill those positions as well. So again, this isn't just a one party trying to fix the system. It's It's a bunch of groups, and I would say a lessons learned of where all of those elements have to be reviewed, inclusive of AHS. And the fact that, docs themselves, and I can't name the name, but I'll give you an example of one doctor that, I tried to help and to no avail, quite frankly, unfortunately. So this gentleman, he got into medicine in the first place. He was inspired as a child because he found out he had a heart condition. So him and his family all had COVID. They had the serology to show it. He's graduated top of the dean's list, been practicing for 16 years, has a predisposed heart condition. Looking at the vaccinations out there, weighed the math, the risk wasn't worth it. And he even got forced into a position where he ended up taking the J&J so he could keep his position, so he could keep practicing with his patients. And again, he's already had COVID, worked through all of that in the first place, is exposed to patients, and then felt compelled or forced to have to do that. Now, where we did get a lot of exemptions was for the rural docs. And then even in the position where we're at now, we finally had that lifted where the testing is, but AHS still maintains that any new hires have to be vaccinated. Now, the concerns I have with the vaccination, if we look at it, and I kind of tongue-in-cheek called it COVID Classic. So the original COVID strain that we had, that's what these vaccines were designed for. And what we've seen is limited or diminishing efficacy on the new strains. So when the Pfizer, using their own numbers, when they're saying it's 70% ineffective for double vaccination for adults, and it's 98% ineffective for children, then I struggle with suggesting that the original vaccination, that we should be, pushing this forward with folks not fully understanding the risks and understanding where they're at. So if it's 30% efficacy, then why would you take the risk of the current strains of where you're at? I struggle with that. So again, with me coming forward and talking about these things so openly, I'm hoping that people will take a sober second pause, look at the information out there, not have the stigma that's been contrived around it and people so polarized, and just really think of where you're at. If it's really worth it, and if you want to do it still, that's fine, but go into it with eyes wide open.
Exactly. And I think when you're talking about something that does come with these risks, provable, and I'm talking to three of you right now who have had terrible reactions to keep pushing forward with it being a mandate is challenging. And it's, I think we can all say we're thankful for people in positions like yours where you can be heard, you can speak to a bigger, broader audience, and it's not as easily hushed. So just wanted to say thank you for coming forward. I imagine that was felt probably a little bit terrifying, a little bit tricky, maybe. I'm not sure, but
no, there was no issues on that. So again,
well,
I'm
good.
6'2", 230, and I used to build major projects. So it wasn't about having our hurt feelings report or feeling timid. I find myself in a difficult position where I tried to keep personal information personal, and where the opposition wants to vilify, and even one member is going out there and is on record now for saying how I done it, to hack into people's medical information. And my caution all the way along on this was that when you start devolving to the point where your classifications of people on their choices, and moreover, when you're ordering a burger and the person that's selling you that, instead of asking if you want fries with it, is asking you for your medical information, we're going down a path here. The law of diminishing returns of what we're looking for. So now we've predisposed a population to have public information. If you don't disclose it, then they're categorizing you as one form or the other. So quite frankly, they made me angry. They frustrated me to the point where, fine, if you want to vilify and start taking another run at me, here's the other side of the story. And maybe you should back off on some of the people for the decisions and why they made it. So it wasn't because I was timid or anything else. It was simply enough was enough. And that here's the rest of the story. And again, I didn't want my position to prejudice any of that. And if you look at any of my social media posts or anything else, I never said, go get the vaccine. And I never said, don't go get the vaccine. Everything was consistent. So people had a judgment and a choice based on the information that they had, and that they went into it with eyes wide open. So that's where I came from. It just, quite frankly, they made me very frustrated and angry, and they wanted to start a fight. I have no problem with finishing it.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And I think there's a lot of people that have felt very frustrated by the process that they have walked through. Again, I've spoken with many doctors who have struggled in this province and other provinces actually in the even just the process of trying to report these, having patients that they're very concerned for come back and say, well, I've been told I still have to be dose 2 vaccinated. So a real challenge for many people. And, I appreciate that you are going public and that you are speaking up for a lot of people who don't have a voice in this, and sort of demanding that it not be silenced. So thank you for that.
Well, and I appreciate the venue, and the more times that we can have open conversations that aren't politicized, that we will get better as people here and as we move forward. And there's going to be a ton of lessons learned out of this, and I would anticipate legislation put in place as well once we get the full understanding. The challenge that I have right now is on the federal level, regardless of what is coming out, that we still seem to be heading down a path of reckless abandon and not listening to what is relevant. It's fixated in an ideology and a belief rather than where we're at. And it's going to take all of us to try to turn that around and understand that we've been divided and conquered. We've been turned on each other as citizens here, and we have to stop that rhetoric. We have to stop talking about our vaccine status. We have to talk about what happened, where we're at, and to make sure that, again, people are well informed and advised of what's happening, and not to live in fear. It's just very compelling, and it tugs on the heartstrings when you hear these stories. And again, like the folks on the call, a lot of them come across my desk because I've said this, and I'll keep tabling your information. And if you do have vaccine injuries or stories and you're not being listened to, send it in to me, and I'll do what I can with it. And I'll make sure that it gets tabled and put on public record so that we do have a historical record of this as well, forever in our answer as is recorded in Alberta history.
Well, that's incredible. Appreciate that. And thank you very much for your time. I know that you are likely very busy. So if you need to jump off, completely understand. Thanks again. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again on this topic.
I appreciate it, folks. Take care.
Okay. And Corinne, I wanted to just chat with you again. You and I had talked about a friend of yours as well. Her name was Claire Duncan, and Claire is a good friend of yours that is actually a triathlete.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned she was also vaccine injured, and she spoke with me today. Wasn't able to join us for the call, but said that she would be okay for you to share a little bit about what she experienced as well.
Yeah, she was diagnosed with mild pericarditis after her 3rd dose. Like me, she felt like she was having a heart attack 24 hours after getting it and went to the hospital. And all tests revealed there was a lot of inflammation, and the doctors think she probably developed it after the 2nd dose because she was having all the symptoms of myocarditis after her 2nd dose, but didn't really pay attention, I guess. And
just pushed through, yeah,
as a triathlete. And she got sent for a CT and an echo, and now she has severe nerve damage in her feet, which came, I guess, a week after her 3rd dose in January, and she still has that right now. And she has radiating chest pain. Her HR was elevated to, I think she said 160 while resting, and she had flu-like symptoms. Her initial cardiologist appointment after her visit to the hospital was scheduled 5 weeks after her diagnosis, which is similar to me. You wait weeks and weeks while you're unable to sleep, you're in pain, you're unable to live your life for these appointments. And then they gave her ibuprofen and suggested bed rest to her, and didn't really give her any information at all on what recovery would look like or her path forward as a triathlete. Just kind of, there you go, bed rest.
You know, when I listen to your experience, when I listen to Claire's experience, Sean, your experience, I just think, Sean, you were telling me too that you lost 60 pounds in a very short amount of time. I mean, this is life changing, and how long this is going to be life changing. Like I can't imagine trying to process the regret, but stay positive, not let this affect you mentally and bring you down. I imagine that's been a bit of a challenge for either of you. Sean, how about you?
It has, but initially I just tried to just focus on my recovery. I knew I had a long way to go and I had lost some intestine, and I kind of had to reinvent how I ate and how I drank and everything else. I found that with time, motivation seems to wane over time. And then that's when I started to struggle with it more and more. I did become, I had a harder time staying positive, and I started to also become more and more bitter about what had happened. Just the complete lack of support, the lack of acknowledgement from a government level, whether it was federal or provincial. There's been absolutely nothing. There's been almost no contact and updates from the Vaccine Injury Support Program. I was fortunate that my work did have long-term disability set up, because I haven't worked now in 8 to 10 months. So initially I was on EI, which doesn't pay particularly well, and then I got transferred over to that. But there's definitely been periods where I just kind of felt, I don't want to say betrayed, or I feel like I put my trust in the health professionals, and I put my trust in our government, and I regret it now, and I wish I hadn't, and I'll never be able to again. When they told me it should be safe for you to go get another vaccine, I couldn't trust them. I did that the first time. They said it was safe to get this vaccine, and it wasn't. And it's just that simple. It very nearly killed me. I lived with a lot of guilt initially, because nobody put a gun to my head and forced me to get this vaccine. I did it on my own accord. And then my children almost lost their father because of it. And the first couple weeks, nurses even had a hard time understanding. When I tell them that the guilt was just overwhelming, I'd break down lying in my bed in the ICU. I just had tears pouring down my face, thinking about my children and my family and what I'd done to them by making this choice. And it turned out to be the worst choice I've ever made in my life. And no, I wouldn't do it again. But it's hard to know that the manufacturers aren't liable, and the government's not liable, and nobody has any sort of responsibility. And then you can't even get acknowledgement or support for your injury after the fact, especially when they're mandating people go get them. And you can't mandate something and tell people go to do something and then just waive all liability and all responsibility after. You have to support people that are injured when you're mandating something like this. And I can't agree with what they're doing and how they're moving forward. BC just postponed a new mandate, which was all the private care sector. So all the dentists, all the chiropractors, massage therapists, everybody that worked in those offices at the end of March was potentially out of a job if they didn't all go get vaccinated. And I just couldn't believe that our province was putting in new mandates at this point, when it feels like everybody's going to get a jab against what's can be treated like a flu or a cold at this point. So I've had a lot of sleepless nights, just trying to come to terms with everything that happened over what seemed like such a harmless thing in the first place. I walked in and got a little jab in my shoulder, and I carried on, and it changed my life potentially forever, because I'll have short bowel syndrome for the rest of my life now. I'm not getting any more intestine back, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Karine, how about you? How has this affected you and your mental health?
It's been a challenge. The 4 months of not being able to sleep and having to sit up all night, no sleep alone is going to do a number. And it was hard to be a mother and to carry out my responsibilities at work, and and also just to deal with constant pain and every breath being a struggle. There were times when I couldn't even talk because it was too much effort. And so then I just didn't even want to be around people, because even the excitement of being around people caused my heart rate to go up to a point where I couldn't, and I'm an extrovert. So just all that alone time that I had to take just to try to recover, and then coupled with the prognosis of you will not be able to work for the rest of your life. You will not be able to participate in society. Like just seeing legislation going into place around the world, and there's nowhere to go to get away from it. It's certainly challenging, and it takes a lot of strength to heal during a time of such uncertainty.
I would agree. I can't imagine how excuse me, how difficult it has probably been. When I put the call out to speak with people and to have them share their stories about being vaccine injured, you can only imagine my inbox was quite full. And I heard from many people. I heard from a Southern Alberta lady. She received 2 Pfizer shots, and within 2 weeks, she was in, similar to you, Sean, terrible abdominal pain, and she was misdiagnosed. I think again, this is part of the struggle. Is that a lot of these doctors don't know what they're up against. They're not sure what they're looking for. People are presenting with symptoms. You can't find anything in the tests. She was misdiagnosed, and then 4 days later, she went back in again, even worse, excruciating pain, and they found that she had a perforated appendix. And her challenge was that they didn't believe that this had anything to do with her vaccine, even though it was within weeks. Until her daughter, she said, looked into it and saw on Pfizer's list of adverse events that appendicitis and issues with the appendix were a known effect from the vaccine. So that was a struggle for her. I had another lady from Ontario. Her name's Liz. She contacted me, 1 dose injured. She does have an exemption. She's a 39-year-old mom of 2. She got vaccinated to be able to work. A lot of people did. A lot of people did it, not necessarily, as you mentioned, Sean, for the reason to be protected, but it was to be able to work and to be able to go out with friends and to be able to live a normal life. She, like you, Corrine, had shortness of breath, joint pain. They found a blood clot in her lungs. I have another person that contacted me, an Ontario law enforcement officer. After 2 doses of Pfizer through May and June, he had ringing in the ears after the first dose, but after the second dose, it has been horrible. Terrible chronic tinnitus, he says. His family doctor and another specialist did confirm it is a vaccine injury with no treatment. So he is still dealing with it. It has not lifted in any way, shape, or form for him, and this is since June. So he's struggling with that. Another person contacted me to let me know that his wife's grandmother also suffered from pericarditis and was hospitalized numerous times, almost died. It was confirmed by a doctor to be vaccine related, and she still ended up having to get her second shot. It's one of those situations where people are making these decisions and feeling pressured or forced. I heard from another mother. This was a lady from Windsor, Ontario. Her 26-year-old son experienced Belle's palsy. This is, again, another terrible side effect that many people have suffered from, and it's sort of the paralysis of one side of your face. It was confirmed as an adverse reaction to the shot from an allergist. Said he should not get the second dose, but again, it was one of those situations where they suggested try the Johnson & Johnson for your second dose, and thankfully he did not react to that second dose. He did go and get the Johnson & Johnson, but again, I understand from from listening to both of you and to many others that this has been, it's been a very strange time. We've never experienced anything like this, and I think there has been a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to speak well for themselves. And even in that, I know, Corinne, you had said part of the reason you feel like you have got somewhere, that you were able to get an exemption for a period of time, was because you could speak up and you could speak well for yourself. And I think there are a lot of people who haven't been able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recognize that the ability to research and articulate is, and to be tenacious while you're feeling so terrible. And, I had the support of my husband helping me along that journey and advocating by my side. And I just can't imagine what it's like for, somebody who's not as familiar with the language, or who isn't supported by the people around them. Um, yeah, I do think advocacy is missing for many.
Well, I would like to kind of thank you both, because you both are, speaking up. You both are taking the opportunity to share, and I think that is part of how we get through this, right? Is bringing awareness to this, giving people an opportunity to speak and a voice and to hear, and I hope that as we move through this, as we get out of this pandemic, that we learn a lot from this, and we don't ever have to repeat some of the mistakes that were made. And I really do hope that both of you are sort of on the mend and continue to get better and can enjoy, a good life with your children as parents, in your work lives. Being fit and active. So that's my hope for both of you. And again, I just want to thank you both for speaking with me today and for sharing your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.